everyone to the peace session titled As a Pathway to Peace on the Korean Peninsula. I'll be working as a moderator. Well, I'm not young, but we have invited great experts who are very much competent, and it is my great honor and privilege to preside this session. Jeju Forum is on the way to become one of the world-leading forum, and so many distinguished speakers and panelists are invited, and that is why, in a way, we weren't able to have enough chances to discuss about peace and also the issue of the Korean Peninsula among young generation, because the youngsters' voice need to be reflected and also needs to be applied for the policy makers when they establish the policies. But it is really great that a young version of Jeju Forum has been kicked off, and I'm very pleased to take part in. I sincerely hope that Asia Pacific Young Leaders Forum can become much greater in scale and also deeper in terms of the discussion depth in addressing the topics. The topics they will be discussing is once again the peace on the Korean Peninsula, especially in Asia Pacific. How can we achieve peace on the Korean Peninsula and also Asia Pacific? Well, the topic itself is quite obscure, abstract, and really wide in terms of the scale. In a way, people might say that peace is something very idealistic concept, especially for Korean people living in a divided nations, and especially we've been struggling and grappling with the issue of the nuclear weapons for the past 3 decades. For us, the issue of the peace on the Korean Peninsula is something a far-fetched one, something unrealizable. But there are things that we have been forgotten about, especially among young people. Serving at the military is mandatory, and whenever a certain nuclear weapons issues occur, it gives a detrimental impact to Korean economy. But we accept it as a matter of course. But when we look at it from the futuristic point of view, in a way, we have neglected these important issues. So-called, we were a path-dependent people, and we took everything as a normal course. Today, at the physical site, we are joined by Professor Eun-jung and other participants, but also we are joined by the Rising Stars expert, Dr. Jessica Lee, and other speakers as well. Well, you can witness the women's power because the panelists that we have invited are young, very talented, and expert. We have invited excellent panelists. We are so lucky to have them with us today. So without further ado, I'd like to hear their presentation. 4 speakers will make a presentation. We don't have much time, but I'll be giving 8 minutes per speaker. The first speaker is Professor Eun-jung of Kongju National University. Online and offline, I have encountered her many times, and definitely she is the rising star. Please go on.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Eun-jung from Kongju National University. I knew the time given to me would be very tight, and for my keynote presentation, I have prepared my presentation in English, so I will read that, and I will be open to further discussion later on.
Thank the organizers, APLN and EAF, and of course JDC, for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak at Asia Pacific Young Leaders Forum. It was my great pleasure to meet all of you who are very young, brilliant people. And today we are here to think about peace of the Korean Peninsula. And my role in this session is to talk about South Korea's unilateral approach. In other words, what South Korea can and should do by itself to build the peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So according to our Ministry of Foreign Affairs explanation, quote, a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula refers to the establishment of peace that is solidly secured in legal, institutional, and concrete terms by formally ending the state of war on the Korean Peninsula among the related countries with the two Koreas lying at the center, quote. So as you just heard, before building a peace regime, Korean MUFA emphasizes that it is necessary to formally end the state of war on the Korean Peninsula among the related countries with the two Koreas lying at the center. Here, I need to highlight the two Koreas should lie at the center, while the big question still big question mark is still on who are the related party beside the two Korea. And when discussing on an opportunity to change the armistice agreement to a peace agreement, there was a view that the only direct party were North Korea and the UN forces. As the name of the agreement suggests, the Korean War Armistice Agreement was signed by the Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command, whose name was Mark Clark, on the one hand, and the Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, who was, of course, Kim Il-sung, and the Commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers, Peng Do-hae, on the other hand. So the South Korean military fought as part of the US-led UN forces, but did not sign the armistice directly. Although the United States has led the UN forces, it is not nominally a direct party. Also, if you look closely at China, the People's Revolutionary Army, a regular army, did not participate in the war. At the time, China, a new country, was reluctant to wage war with the UN forces. So they created an alternative called the People's Volunteer Army. This is why some experts, like, for example, Larry Wussel, who was the director of the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation, he argued that a peace agreement should be a continuation of the armistice, meaning it should be done between North and the UN forces. Of course, it cannot be an acceptable conclusion to South Korea. We fought in the war, and hundreds of thousands of South Korean soldiers and civilians were killed and wounded. When the UN commander signed the signature, the South Korean side was also present. So since the armistice, we have been suffering from the complicating aftermath of the war, even until today. And we are the people who will live in the peninsula from now on. So the Republic of Korea, therefore, is a de facto real party of the war and the armistice. So this historical background and the reality we have became the rationale for the April 27 North-South Panmunjom Declaration in 2018. So according to the declaration, the two sides agreed to declare the end of war this year. This year means, again, the 2018. That marks the 65th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement and actively promote the holding of trilateral meetings involving the two sides and the United States, or quadrilateral meetings involving the two sides, the United States and China, with a view to replacing the Armistice Agreement with a peace agreement and establishing a permanent and solid peace regime, quote. So President Moon Jae-in proposed declaring a formal end to the Korean War in his UN speech at the UN General Assembly this year on September 24, which can be regarded, I think, as a unilateral approach to resume the stalled diplomacy with North Korea. Also, President Moon met Pope Francis recently when visiting Italy to attend the G20 on October 29. I gave him a cross. I think many of you were impressed by the cross made from the barbed wire from the peninsula's DMZ. And he re-asked Pope Francis to visit North Korea. This is another good example, I think, of the current government's effort to inspire the rest of the world and emphasize the importance of peace on the peninsula. So, of course, skepticism prevails both domestically and internationally. Many would doubt the Moon administration's explanation that the end of war declaration is more just political rather than legal. And there are a number of legal, political, and diplomatic challenges to solve this problem. However, I don't think those efforts made by this government are just meaningless. Ending the war literally means ending the war. However, ending the war can be achieved without a declaration of an end to the war. Although South Korea and China were enemies that aimed guns during the Korean War, but we didn't actually declare an end to the war. But South Korea and China now really two of the most important partners to each other. So I hope my country, South Korea, will not give up its already strong will to change the relationship with the North Korea. And I also request the North Korea to have a corresponding will to bring peace to the peninsula. Aristotle stated that the proper telos, again, aim of war should be peace. So the two Koreas who fought against each other, therefore, I hope again they should aim for peace together. Two parties' will for peace are now the most important precondition, and the two need to persuade other related parties, such as the United States and China, Japan, Russia. So again, thank you for giving me this wonderful chance, and I'm looking forward to the further discussion. Thank you.
네, 이문정 교수님 감사합니다. 예, 박수 주십시오. 최근에 문제가 되고 있고.
Recently, we are talking a lot about Armistice Agreement, and Professor Lim has done a good job of summarizing the background and the current status of background of the declaration of war. There seems to be two extreme views. When the end of the war is declared, people are worried that the current system might collapse and the U.S. forces might withdraw from the Korean Peninsula. And such a move is very symbolic and political. If declaring the end of the war is such a political activity, then this is really meaningless, and we don't have to go to extreme to pursue a declaration of the end of the war. And this is the English profile, so I would like to introduce the next speaker in English.
Ms. Jessica Lee, good to see you, Jessica. Okay, she's a senior associate fellow at APLN and a senior research fellow in the East Asia program at Quincy Institute. And her research focuses on U.S. foreign policy toward the Asia-Pacific region, with an emphasis on alliance and North Korea. I have a long list of her profile, but to save time, Jessica, the floor is yours, please.
Great. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm sorry I'm not there in person with an all-women panel. It would have been really fun to get together and chat it with all the panelists afterwards, but very much appreciate this kind invitation to speak, and of course to APLN for inviting me, so thank you. As an elder millennial, as sometimes I'm referred to, I used to not like being invited to events that had words like young people, young leaders in it. But now that I'm older, I actually feel great when I get invited to panels like this, where most of the fellow speakers are under 40 years of age. I think. So I think this is great. Indeed, I think diversity of perspectives, lived experiences, and a sense of idealism that tends to pervade in young people are really important for imagining a different future on the peninsula. Before I dive into my comments about peace and disarmament efforts that can lead to, through bilateral cooperation, I want to highlight the importance of having new, fresh perspectives in discussions about North Korea and foreign policy more generally. Here in the United States, there's a growing sense among young people that forever wars are simply unsustainable. and that they threaten America's ability to protect vital interests, such as US's domestic needs. A recent survey by the Eurasia Group Foundation found that young people between ages of 18 and 29 were especially wary of war. Some 62% believe the United States should respond to China's rise by decreasing, not increasing, its military footprint in Asia, and to pursue diplomatic solutions instead. That's a 7% increase from last year. Nearly half of the young people surveyed thought that peace is best achieved by keeping a focus on domestic needs while avoiding unnecessary interventions beyond the borders of the US. After watching the US government spend $8 trillion in post 9/11 wars, young people understandably want to reduce the chance of war, whose cost we will have to bear. So in order to understand North Korea's intentions and capabilities, the United States and South Korea will really need to engage the regime head on. It needs to coordinate with each other too, Washington and Seoul, toward a step-by-step process that establishes peace with the Korean War era enemy, as well as reduce tensions on the peninsula through reductions in both conventional and nuclear capabilities between the two Koreas. To get to that ambitious and long-term goal, the United States and North Korea, as well as the North and South, will really need to focus on building trust and confidence in each other and building political support for a long process toward peace. On the US-North Korea side, the biggest barrier to progress that I can see is that there's a total absence of trust on both sides. Washington blames North Korea for all past negotiations and their failures. And North Korea blames the United States for the same exact thing. North Korea further feels that after the abrupt end of the Hanoi summit in 2019, that the United States doesn't seem to have anything to offer that is concrete, that would make its return to negotiating table logical. Pyongyang wants to see some concrete moves toward a less hostile policy, perhaps including sanctions removal, rather than vague statements about talking without preconditions, which is what the Biden administration has offered to date. On the North-South side, there is considerable amount of mistrust as well, especially after the 2018 Panmunjom Declaration, which included what I think was an end of war declaration, failed to lead to confidence-building measures and a tangible progress toward peace. Fortunately, several efforts at the bilateral and multilateral levels can help break the current stalemate in US-North Korea and inter-Korean talks. First, Washington should signal its willingness to work with China and Russia on their draft proposal at the UN Security Council to lift certain UN Security Council sanctions that affect North Korean people. Washington does not have to accept every single letter, every single word in that draft, but it should improve upon it and work on it with genuine interest. Included in this proposal is language that would allow the Inter-Korean Railway project to commence, which would figuratively and literally bridge the two Koreas, while also highlighting the importance of inter-Korean cooperation as the main driver of stability on the Korean Peninsula. Second, bold steps at bilateral levels are needed to make a clean break with the past. For Washington, that means make clear signals that it seeks a new type of relationship with North Korea. For South Korea, it means not marginalizing those who seek a more stable path with North Korea, or unnecessarily politicizing those who are pushing toward a diplomatic solution. 7 decades after the Korean War broke out, United States, South Korea, and North Korea have changed in dramatic ways. In the current climate and in the current moment that we live in, where we're witnessing a global pandemic, small steps such as video conference calls at the expert level, followed by government to government level discussions, could create relatively easy on-ramps away from the public spotlight. In 1952, then Republican presidential nominee Dwight D. Eisenhower laid out his plan for ending the Korean War. He said, to forego the diversions of politics and to concentrate on the job of ending the Korean War. Until that job is honorably done, that job requires a personal trip to Korea. I shall make that trip. Only in that way could I learn how best to serve the American people in the cause of peace. President Biden has the chance to fulfill Eisenhower's pledge. To be clear, South Korea has already been moving fairly aggressively toward a bilateral relationship that is more peace-oriented. It's able to do that in part because its leader chooses to see North Korea as it is, not as it wishes it to be. This is in remarkable contrast to the United States, where North Korea is routinely dehumanized, caricatured, and parodied in popular media, which enables the inflation of the national security risk posed by North Korea and serves to justify a brutal sanctions strategy against Pyongyang. Perhaps the Biden administration and Hollywood would do well to take a closer look at how South Korea portrays its neighbor to the north of the 38th parallel in shows like Squid Game, which everyone is talking about here in the United States. That show happens to present a more human side of North Korea with its lead character, one of its lead characters, Kang Se-byuk, played by Chung Ho-yeon. She's a North Korean defector, and she enters the game to earn money to support her younger brother, who is currently in a South Korean orphanage, and to pay exploitive brokers to smuggle her surviving family members out of North Korea. Her elder brother and grandparents died from a plague in North Korea when she was a child. Kang's character is sympathetically portrayed as a struggling person trying to improve her life and that of her family, much like most of the Squid Game participants. And that's a big departure from how North Koreans are usually treated in the United States media. Of course, criticizing the Kim government does not necessarily reflect a disregard for the conditions of the North Korean people. The problem with these caricatures is that North Koreans, outside of Kim Jong-un and other top political and military leaders, are often rendered invisible, both by their own government as well as by the international community. And the more North Korea is essentialized as Kim Jong-un, the less likely the outside world will view the country beyond Kim. To conclude, I encourage Americans and North Koreans to leverage the current pandemic to resume talks, perhaps through Zoom, but quietly and eagerly and genuinely, and to understand where each others are coming from. For South Koreans and North Koreans, I would encourage them to focus on multilateral opportunities, such as the UN Security Council resolution, sanctions draft resolution that I mentioned, which would allow things like inter-Korean economic cooperation and the railway to resume. I think taking small steps in all of this will be key. Each small step will make the next bigger step easier. And all parties should assume, most importantly, all parties should avoid assuming, the worst in each other, and instead pursue peace because it is good and it is in our self-interest to find a peninsula that is less volatile than it is today. I will stop here and look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. 우리 제시카 선생님은
Dr. Jessica Lee has talked about the U.S. intervention in many foreign countries and domestic opposition against U.S. intervention, especially among people. And the U.S. has been at war all the time. It's often said that America is at war. So in the past, international politics used to dominate domestic politics, but now domestic politics often dominate international politics. Domestic cost of foreign policy is often referred to, and it is happening in Korea as well. The Peace Research Institute in Seoul researches daily trend every day, and people who do not wish, only 38% want unification on the Korean Peninsula. This is really shocking. And the young people don't seem to want unification. And those who support unification is dwindling in number because of the fact that we are so used to armistice, and people sometimes want armistice agreement to last forever, when the permanent, sustainable peace is not an option. We sometimes want to pursue the current status, but I think it's a myth. And just Dr. Lee has talked about distrust between the U.S. and North Korea, but the question I want to ask to Dr. Lee is Donald Gregg, who was U.S. ambassador in Korea, and I have read his memoir. And in the last chapter of his memoir, he said that the U.S. attitude to enemy countries has failed because they demonize the enemy. And once you demonize the enemy, you cannot negotiate. And North Korea is often seen as a demon to Americans, and it's popular to demonize North Koreans. So we really have to find a solution to that. And I want to ask a relevant question to Dr. Lee later on. Next speaker is
Associate Professor at Faculty of International Relations, Asia University. Before joining Asia University, she worked as a project assistant professor at the Policy Alternative Research Institute, the University of Tokyo. Again, I have a long list of profile, but floor is yours. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. So let me jump right in since time is limited. My role is to talk from a regional perspective in terms of how to achieve peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and on the Asian Pacific region as a whole. So let me start off by pointing out some of the more pessimistic viewpoints on this issue. So unfortunately, we have mostly seen failure when it comes to regional approaches in Northeast Asia. There are currently many security issues that are embedded in this region, but I would say that there are two especially really big and important issues which are on perhaps a different level of concern, but poses great insecurity. Both can be regarded as regional matters, but at the same time also affect the international community as well, so it may also be considered as an international/global issue. The first is, of course, the issue of North Korea. We have tried to deal with this issue within, for example, creating a framework such as the six-party talks as a regional security architectural effort, but we really haven't seen success in terms of its ultimate goal, which is the denuclearization of DPRK. As it is unlikely that DPRK will return to multilateral negotiations, to rebuild a security architecture without the main country of concern poses a big question mark in terms of the need for inclusiveness regarding participation and effectiveness of the architecture itself. As we all know, history has taught us that bilateral negotiations have failed in terms of DPRK. Multilateral negotiations have also failed. So should we look for other tactics, or should we revisit these negotiation styles all over again? I don't really have the answer, but that is something that we really have to think about. The second insecurity is the rising tension between the US and China. This, although having a huge influence on the region itself, it actually gives little space for countries besides the two powers to actually move the stalled circumstance. So it is basically a question of bilateral relations between the US and China, with perhaps a somewhat indirect influence by the alliance countries such as the ROK and Japan. But then not so much can be done in terms of regional security architecture in that sense. Since many of the concerned countries in this region do have really different security concerns, it would be quite difficult to unite the team into one and deal with certain issues, leaving behind other issues that may be of interest to other countries, which may lead to differences in enthusiasms and efforts put into the framework itself. Also, the change in government may lead to changes of that country's attitudes towards the regional approaches, sometimes towards a good direction, but other times to a more worse situation. Now, on the brighter and more futuristic point of view, the current US administration is committed to cooperating with like-minded states, such as the ROK and Japan, to pursue peace and security and stability in this region. So cooperation is always a key factor when it comes to peace and stability. We can't really achieve peace and stability by the effort of just one country, individual country. We must work together in order to achieve a common goal. So I think it is really important to acknowledge what that goal is in each of the countries in this region to begin with. So this can be a good time, hopefully, for example, for a fresh restart for both the ROK and Japan to revisit their vital interests in the region and reconfirm that cooperation amongst themselves is actually really essential when it comes to the issue of regional security, particularly stability on the Korean Peninsula. On the other hand, these like-minded states gatherings may create Chinese anxiety, which may deteriorate the security environment in the region. So that's the downside. This is due to the fact that there seems to be a race for power regarding the leadership of any regional initiatives that have popped out in recent years. So regional matters can be easily converted to international/global matters, which is in part a good thing, but also the situation might get lost regarding the true aim of the initiative, because it can be replaced by the power game going on between the superpowers. So in order to avoid such replacements from happening, member states in the region should rethink about common values that they share, as well as what sort of threats, concerns there are that are shared amongst themselves. This is important because we need all of the states involved to acknowledge their benefits in participating in such regional frameworks. Also, a regional level framework would be great if it can come all together and be effective, but if not, we can start from sub-regional bilateral groups and build confidence amongst each other to move on to the next step. So for the next generation, I think it is extremely important to build confidence amongst each other on a personal level as well, and also to go to elections, especially national elections, to voice out their opinion so that the national leaders can see how the public is reacting to their foreign policy and security policy. So in Japan, we just had our lower house elections on October 31st, and the voting rate was about 55% in total, which is quite a shame. But for the people in their 20s, it was down to 30%. So this will not change the future, and so it would be really important for these next generations to step up their games. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. MUKAI and Wakana. 많은 얘기들을 해주셨는데.
She has mentioned a lot of points, especially multilateral and bilateral negotiations have failed multiple times in the past. And North Korea has nuclear power now, but in 1994, when there was the first nuclear test, Geneva Agreement was signed between North Korea and the US, but when there was second round of meeting, it was six-party talks. between North Korea and the US. And I think these two issues must be combined together. When the bilateral talks fail, then multilateral can come in. And if multilateral fails, then bilateral can come in. So it should be a two-track approach. And I'll talk about that again with Professor Wakana. Now, I think Korea-Japan relationship is really important. And also trilateral relationship between Korea, Japan, and the United States really important. But these days, the three countries came together mainly to repress and oppress North Korea. So I think the three countries first has to agree on clear set of peace initiatives. And if Korea, Japan, and the United States gather together to oppress North Korea, that will put China on an anxious level as well. So we should show solidarity for peace alliance. So next speaker.
But not least, Hinda PANDEY is a foreign policy analyst focusing on nuclear national security issues. She currently works as Associate Fellow with Center for Air Power Studies, where she tracks developments related to North Korea's nuclear issue and Iran's nuclear program. Ms. Hina PANDEY, I'm sorry, floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And very good morning, everyone. Let me first begin by expressing my deepest gratitude to the organizers at the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for having me this opportunity to speak to all of you all at such an august gathering. Now, the topic that I will be discussing today aims at answering how international community and international players can promote peace and disarmament in the Korean Peninsula. Now, I would like to emphasize at the very beginning that any discussion that is focused on promoting peace and disarmament must begin with empathy and some very realistic expectations of what this peace will be. Because in the recent times, we have seen that extreme approaches to the North Korean nuclear issue, that are also aimed at punishing a country, has not been very successful. Despite the harshest of the UN sanction, despite an unprecedented pandemic, the North Korean nuclear resolve remains unchanged and also robust, if I may say. In addition to this, the prospects for fresh negotiations and bilateral nuclear diplomacy, which began with a very, with a landmark summit at Singapore, but it also became halted till Hanoi. And the current prospect of resuming such a nuclear diplomacy, to me, looks a little bleak. The Biden administration has expressed its willingness to resume nuclear diplomacy. However, there is a lack of shared understanding on the issue of comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible disarmament. So there is no mutually accepted definition between the two parties. And in the recent times, there has been no indication from the North Korean side as well whether they would want to resume the nuclear diplomacy. So the challenge here is how to arrive at a shared understanding. And what would this shared understanding of disarmament and its pathways would be? To start, to begin understanding the pathways and to begin understanding the concept of disarmament, I think a continuous exchange of views should really take place. especially at a time when two active players and two active players that are responsible for the only channel of functioning are shut. So in this context, when there is an absence of bilateral nuclear diplomacy, when the negotiating channels are shut, there is a space is created for international players, and they can then come in and take up the issue. I would propose a three-tier sort of solution to the North Korean nuclear issue, which is a continued track to diplomacy, and at the same time, there should be engagement at the regional forum with international partners. This this should be sustained, and at the same time, at the very highest level, the concerning parties, there should be some arrangement like P5+1 or P5+3, so to speak. So a three-tier solution is important. And I think a significant takeaway from the conclusion of JCPOA has been that dialogue and diplomacy can break through one of the most pressing challenges. So at the highest level, P5+1 or 3 can talk about nuclear restraint, can discuss the framework of nuclear restraint. At the second level, track to diplomacy can address and facilitate better understanding of objectives and explanations. For instance, if there is a test that North Korea has done, instead of a unilateral projection of messaging, the bilateral, the track to diplomacy can discuss those issues. And at the very basic level, regional forums and international organizations can come in and keep pumping the economic aid, which is very beneficial because there has been a talk of maximum sanction pressure. And the rationale for all of this, I think, should come from a collective responsibility of all the UN member states, which they have addressed in their 2030 agenda for sustainable development of the goals. So if the UN members are really serious about attainment of sustainable development goals by 2030, progress on zero hunger, good health and well-being, decent work and economic growth needs to be incorporated. And this is one place where North Korea and rest of the UN members have a shared understanding. So I think by, attempting to shift the focus and looking at promoting the SDGs, I'm sure some pathways to peace could be discussed. And just want to reiterate once again that North Korea too has expressed its willingness to support all the SDGs. And one of the 17th goal of SDG is that member states should create effective partnerships to implement the SDGs. So this comes to full circle. And just on my last concluding remark would be that from the standpoint of non-proliferation as well, it is important that states resolve the nuclear conundrum, because in the 50th year of the NPT, and a possible nuclear crisis kind of erodes nuclear norms. And international community cannot be a bystander when the government's military pursuit is being followed at the expense of human development. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hina.
Dr. Pina PANDEY, thank you very much. Dr. PANDEY has made a very impressive comment. Empathy is really essential here, she said, and trying to punish the others rarely leads to rarely leads to success. And there was an online question, and I think Dr. PANDEY has already answered the question. The question was, in order to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula, what level, global, regional, bilateral, or unilateral effort should be made? And Dr. Hina PANDEY has said that multi-channel should be simultaneously mobilized, especially the UN, NPT, she has mentioned multilateral channels. And I want to ask a question to Dr. PANDEY regarding empathy. We still have a myth about North Korea, and that is North Korea, if they can get white rice and beef soup, we thought that it was their biggest wish for the North Korean people because they are so starved. But I think they really care about survival of the national institution. If Kim Jong-un, they say they had to develop the nuclear weapon so that they don't have to worry about the security and go back to building the economy. And South Korea is much better off than North Korea. And except for the nuclear power, we have much more stronger weapons, and we have allies with the United States and Japan, South Korea, and the U.S. If the North Korea feels that they are threatened by these three countries, I think we can have empathy with North Korea about how insecure they feel. We have about 50 minutes remaining. We have two things to do. First is to give the chance to the panelists to make any further comments, add to the comments they want to make, or if they have questions to other panelists, we'll give them a couple more minutes to have a discussion among themselves. Professor Eun-jung first. In our panel discussion, I've talked about South Korea's unilateral approach because that's what organizer asked me to emphasize. And the Korean government is trying to work on making end of the war declaration. But I also read from other articles, and whenever I have a chance to talk, I have emphasized that Korea's will or commitment is really important because we are a direct party to this issue. But as Dr. Kim Joon-hyung has mentioned, we have to pull out all the stops. We have to leverage all possible instruments given to us, especially I can see some tangible changes with European countries, which I found to be encouraging. We need to get out of the box. We need to try to move out of the box and try to have new thinking. I know there are many skeptics about such efforts, but we cannot just settle down with the status quo because our destiny depends on this. And we have to put all we have in these diplomatic efforts. We have to leverage all possible diplomatic resources and create as much room as possible for cooperation. Of course, North Korea's position, if we try to put ourselves in their shoes, we might be able to feel some level of empathy, but still, the nuclear issue must be resolved before we can move on to other issues. That's something we cannot make concession on. Of course, economic exchanges, of course, that's something we want. But before we can do that, we really have to deal with the nuclear issue first and foremost. And the commitment of the U.S. is really important, and I want to emphasize that once again. Thank you very much. Professor Im.
So, Dr. Jessica Lee, including the question that I posed to you, dehumanizing North Korea is once again the overall view of the United States. How can we change that? And on top of that, any additional comment? Please go on.
Sure. Thank you. Oh, apologies. Thank you for those questions. You know, as I said in my remarks, I do agree with you that this issue of failing to see North Korea as humanity is a major challenge that must be overcome. United States has relations with many countries around the world, some of whom whose values we don't agree with. You know, countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, and its treatment of women. we still manage to work around those differences because it's important for the United States to have diplomatic relations and to be aware of what's going on around the world. In the case of North Korea, unfortunately, we know very little. And through travel bans and many other restrictions, we intentionally close off ourselves from any meaningful engagements with North Korea. So this is going to continue to be a problem and a challenge because we just won't know enough about North Korea to make informed decisions. On top of that, we are in some ways preventing other countries like South Korea from learning more about North Korea's intentions and capabilities through engaging directly, on things like joint railway projects. So I do think that there is a role that the U.S. is playing here that is contributing to this current situation that is getting more and more destabilizing. The only other thing I would add, and I'll be brief, is that something that I've noticed among critics of an end of war declaration or peace process has been, well, you're really talking about U.S. withdrawal of troops from South Korea. You're talking about a unilateral, precipitous withdrawal of troops, and you just want the alliance to end tomorrow, and you want U.S. to just leave. But I think they are sort of confusing two separate issues. Anything that has to do with U.S. troops or U.S. defense of South Korea is something that should be negotiated and agreed upon between the United States and South Korea. This is not something that should be negotiated with North Korea. So, we are kind of intentionally confusing these issues in a way that I think is incredibly unhelpful. Same way that people sort of intentionally confuse terms like end of war declaration and a peace treaty, which are two very different things. So I think we need to be really careful about what we're talking about here. And, I think folks who say, well, moving too quickly toward a peace regime, some 70 years later, if you call that too quickly, I'm not sure, what to make of that. I mean, to me, this is so, overdue. But some still say this is too quick. We can't move too quickly. It will, only increase calls for U.S. troops to leave. That under conditions that could alarm, South Korea, Japan, or entice North Korea to exert pressure against South Korea. Now, these are legitimate concerns, of course, but I do think that when you look at the public opinion polls, South Koreans want the U.S. troops to stay unless and until security conditions on the peninsula improve. And so I think that we need to be really clear about, the value of a peace process without the fear mongering and really confusing people and everybody involved about what we're talking about. There will come a time where, discussions at the alliance level will take place about the future of U.S. presence, but this is not the time to worry about that. We have much more work to do up front to de-escalate tensions and to start, the slow process of building trust that I think is essential for any agreement with North Korea to stick.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Now, to Professor MUKAI Wakana, I have a question. As I've mentioned before, if you have any extra comments, please do so. And my question was, I fully agree that Korea-Japan relations must be improved, but Korea, Japan, and the United States have exerted pressure on North Korea all the time. But is there any room for three countries to agree on peaceful moves in dealing with North Korea? So what do you think about having some peaceful approach to North Korea?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that's a really difficult question, which I don't really have an answer to. But if we are to think about a peaceful move equals diplomatic move, I think that's one of the very important tools that we have to use in terms of not negotiating, but trying to turn the situation around on the Korean Peninsula. I think that also relates to the points that Dr. PANDEY mentioned, that empathy is important in part, but I also think that pressure becomes important in some parts as well. Carrots and sticks are always there. You can't choose just single. You have to kind of smartly move the tools around to figure out the right timing to pose which. And so I think a peaceful move together with some pressure, not just from the three countries, but from the international community as a whole, to kind of voice out same message towards North Korea is becoming extremely important nowadays. And I also have a question to my colleagues here. Several of you have mentioned about the importance of trust and confidence, and I also mentioned a bit about confidence building in my comments as well. But from your perspective, how can we actually build confidence amongst these countries? Like, we use the word confidence and like daily, but it's really, I think it's really hard to build confidence, especially in Northeast Asian region. So if you have any comments on that, I would be really happy to hear them out. Thanks.
네, 감사합니다. 질문까지 해주셨는데.
Thank you, Professor Wakana, and thank you for the question about how we can build trust and confidence. Is it really feasible to do that? I think Professor Wakana has given me a much harder question to answer. And last but not least, Dr. PANDEY, can you also cover this question from Professor Wakana as well? And empathy with North Korea also has to play here. I think it's like a vicious cycle. North Korea makes a provocative move, and then we lose confidence in North Korea. And then it's very difficult to have empathy about North Korea. But this could be easier if we're trying to empathize with North Korean people. But when it comes to North Korea's issues of survival, economic difficulties, if we can make it an international discourse so that we can get more support from around the world. So do you have any ideas about making that happen?
I just want to say that the COVID pandemic has also given us an opportunity to engage on issues that matter to us the most. Health, for instance, the vaccination program. North Korea has claimed that it hasn't had a COVID case ever since the pandemic started. But these are just, of course, domestic propaganda as well. And there are several other international reportings that have claimed the cases of pandemic that have been reported. So why don't we start with vaccination? Really smaller issues can lead to bigger decisions. Vaccination is one. Then data collection on census, the GDP, tabulation of GDP. North Korea is reporting its SDG goals by a national task force. Can some countries assist that and see how the reporting is done? So these may not be really big tectonic issues that may introduce changes, but these are smaller building blocks that I feel can, be utilized in, I think, developing trust and addressing trust deficit. With that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. PANDEY. We do not have much time left, but whenever we have this kind of session, we always run out of time, but we still have some time left. So most of the questions that we have received can be categorized into two questions. About the stalemate, how are we going to break through the current stalemate? And then this is a youth session for young leaders. And what kind of specific activities can young people do? I think these are two very worthwhile questions to answer, because we always have this inertia going back to the status quo. And then sometimes we feel it's natural to use military power to keep peace. But I think this is not sustainable. We have to persuade people that we need to go for peace regime, and that depends on the power of the leaders. This is insecure now, but is it satisfactory? I think it's up to the leaders to come up with satisfactory alternative, and that is a true test of a good leader. So very briefly, I would like to give 1 minute to each panelist to make a comment about this. Do we have 10 minutes left? Yes.
So we have 9 minutes. So
9분.
give a like concluding remarks for 2 minutes, and then including my question and question from panel from online.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. What's really regrettable is that we keep talking about trust, but when it comes to institutions and regime, there is a big gap. It's the same situation for Korea and the United States. The vulnerability of the presidential system is that there is strong bipolarization of the politics, and everything tends to be extremely polarized. And we see that all the time in Korean presidential campaign. And whenever there is a regime, administration change, they tend to overthrow what was done in the previous administration. And all the power is centralized on the president. That is the limit of the presidential system, not being able to give full trust, and vice versa with North Korea. And plus, this working level dialogue. But when it comes to the North Korean top decision maker, Kim Jong-un, how effectively can we penetrate to him? How effectively is the message being communicated to Kim Jong-un? Because we cannot talk to Kim Jong-un directly all the time. So in that case, what kind of diplomatic competency can we exercise? There's a big question mark about that. And as I've briefly mentioned before, if we see things not working amongst us, then we could try to work with another company like Sweden that could be more neutral in dealing with North Korea. So we could also get in that kind of third parties involved. Of course, we cannot fully depend on that channel, but I think that kind of channel can at least get us started on the next talk. And since this is a Young Leaders Forum and I teach my students in college, and I feel like the national community might sound tedious sometimes, but we have this beautiful Korean peninsula at the end of this major continent, and we are at the tip end of the Korean peninsula, Jeju Island, which is really beautiful. I think we should really revive passion for our country. From Baekdu Mountain to Jeju Island, we really need to revive our love and commitment to the national community and this beautiful land. I think we need to share the inspiration. Of course, I also belong to the older generation in this perspective, but I really want to inspire young Korean people about their sense of commitment and love for the Korean country. Thank you very much.
Jessica, Dr. Jessica Lee.
Jessica.
Dr. Jessica
I'll say
Lee.
a few words. Thank you so much again for this opportunity. There's so many difficult questions. It's hard to answer them in 1 minute.
You have
so
2 minutes.
sorry
2
in
minutes.
advance.
You have 2 minutes.
I still think that's a little bit short, but yes, I think essentially, we need to, just going back to my earlier point, create more opportunities for younger, fresher voices and perspectives to be heard. Not just in a let's check the box and do this event and make ourselves feel good about diversity and inclusion, but actually take into account the views that are being presented in forums like this seriously. And I think they have to be done in a sustained way. I mean, some of the people who are most ingenious and creative in foreign policy and international relations are women, young women. Yet they are disproportionately represented in these conversations about North Korea. Many events in Washington that have anything to do with the Korean Peninsula, 80–90% of the panel are men. These are men who have negotiated with North Koreans in the past and have come away bruised and, skeptical and cynical. So, they take positions that, I think in some ways, in some respects, are meant to sort of defend what has happened. But we don't need defensiveness. We just need good ideas that will stick. So I do think that we need to completely think differently about, how we have those conversations, because the status quo is just not working. I mean, ask anyone who works on North Korea issue. Like, nobody's happy about what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. Things are just getting worse and worse. So to say, that, pursuing a different route is too radical, it doesn't purport with reality. And furthermore, I would say the people making these arguments are oftentimes not held accountable for bad decisions in the past. Why did the agreed framework fail? Well, a bunch of folks in Congress decided that they were not going to uphold it. I mean, that is at least one of the reasons why that agreement didn't stick. So I do think we need to have some honest conversations about what happened, what is the actual history, and to really, take some good lessons to heart. Because if we keep telling myths about ourselves to ourselves only, we're never going to get to a place where we can actually talk to the other side. So I hope that we can have more frank discussions, because this issue is so grave and serious that, this magical thinking that we're currently on, where we all think that we've done the best we could and everything's been tried, simply is not true.
네, 감사합니다. 다음.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Now, Professor Wakana.
Thank you very much. I totally agree with what Jessica just said, that our voices really need to be heard. One way, I guess, is what I've also said in my comments earlier on, that the younger generation, I think, has to go to these elections, vote, and tell the government if their policies are bad, like show it by voting. I think that's one of the ways and one of the really good tools that a democratic country has. We are all in a democratic country, which means that we have the right to vote. So I think the younger generation really has to acknowledge that fact. And also, I think the survival of the Korean Peninsula itself and the region itself relates to the survival of the international community as whole. And I think that the interaction between domestic, regional, and international community, I think we really have to think about the consequences that may happen, not just in the region, but in the globe as a whole. So I think that's the two important things that the younger generation really has to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 2분 정도 남았는데요. 나중에
2 minutes are left, and we'll give opportunity to the floor. So anyone physically attending, you can say it now. Lastly, Dr. Fendi.
Yeah, I'll just have one short comment to make, which is, I've addressed that in my presentation, is that one way to break the stalemate is to engage at multiple channels, keep the conversation going on. If one channel fails, alternative channels should be open to discuss pressing issues, and a shared understanding of objectives should continuously follow. How youth can contribute into such an endeavor: language, tourism, Korean studies, understanding of Korean studies, application of, not only just a realist lens to understand the nuclear issue, but also constructivist lens in terms of IR and fellowships. That can be promoted. Scholarship needs to be promoted that is not looking at the issue from, a very narrow-minded focus. So I think, and lastly, Juche, there are certain Korean concepts that the world needs to know, and we would be happy to engage and learn more, and discuss more on those issues. So I think education about the culture needs to be promoted as well. Thank you.
감사합니다. 혹시 질문 있으신가요?
Thank you very much. Is there any question from the floor? No?
To save time. 오늘 정말
So we've had a lot of good discussions today. I learned a lot. So there's gender politics in international politics, and as Dr. Jessica Lee mentioned, well, when it comes to weapon, wars, sanctions, there are more masculine terms, and such masculine terms up until now dominated international politics. I don't fully agree with her on that point, but When it comes to young and women in Korea, this session was really young and women session. It was really inspiring and enriching. I hope this could take more center stage in the future. Young and women's voice should be heard more loudly and clearly. And I've said in the beginning, Jeju Youth Forum, I hope it can evolve into a bigger forum. Thank you everybody for joining us.
Excellent panel and an excellent suggestions and opinion. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, everybody.